Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here for our first spotlight tour of the spring 2025 semester. I'm really excited to talk about this absolutely beautiful painting that we have in our collection. This is, I'll be quite honest, is my favorite painting in the collection. When I was a graduate student, I studied Rembrandt, an entire course devoted to him. And so we studied several of his pupils and assistants, and particularly Ferdinand Bol and Govert Flinck. So in 2017, when this work was an intended gift to the museum, needless to say, I was pretty darn jumping out of my shoes thinking, oh my gosh, we have a Ferdinand Bol in our collection. So I'm going to kind of give you a little background on Bol, a little biographical, and then situating him in that period of the golden age of Baroque art, and then talk a little bit more specifically about the painting. So Ferdinand Bol, who was born in 1616, died in 1680. He was from Dordrecht in the Netherlands, which is about 95 kilometers south of Amsterdam, if that gives some geographic reference. He entered into, in his teenage years, into the studio of Jacob Gerritz Cuyp, who was the most noted painter in Dordrecht, who was specifically a portrait painter, but who also did historic scenes. And this is where Bol really was introduced to the fundamentals of art. Typical of a pupil entering into a workshop, he would have been doing a lot of very menial tasks at first, typically preparing canvases, mixing paints, and then he would be really engaging in a lot of studio practices such as drawing and working on compositions and learning from his mentor, Cuyp, and really kind of emulating. And this was really important for a lot of the teachers, that their students were emulating, because what they ended up doing, as Bol would eventually do, is to assist in the creation of paintings that ultimately would have been signed or attributed to Cuyp, not Bol as an assistant. So we really don't know a lot about his particular style until after he leaves. So at about 1636, when Bol was 20 years old, he then left Cuyp's workshop and moved up to Amsterdam. And the most important, the most noted, and today the most renowned painter in Amsterdam in the 17th century was Rembrandt van Rijn. And Bol entered into his workshop as a pupil there and working his way up as an assistant. Now, one of the things that scholars have talked about Bol is that particularly in the 1630s, the works that he was working on. So he was with Rembrandt 1636 until sometime late 1641 or early 1642. His first signed works attributed solely to him date to 1643, 1644. So we know that that period upon when he left Rembrandt's workshop. His works, like many of Rembrandt's pupils and assistants, have been misattributed to Rembrandt. And so there was a lot of work that had been done, I believe it was about 25 years ago, 30 years ago, on a complete survey of Rembrandt's work. And they were really establishing reattributions of works. So many of the works now we recognize as by Flinck or Bol or by others in the workshop. His work really emulates Rembrandt's style of what we refer to as the tronies, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But the connection that he has with Rembrandt, and this work deviates some from that, but it would typically be the tronies were portraits that were typically from about waist or bust up, where typically the figure is making direct eye contact, is looking out at the viewer. But more importantly, the figure is typically placed in either the foreground or middle ground and is dressed in elaborate clothing that is not contemporary to the time that it was made. Now, this was incredibly popularized by Rembrandt when he did a lot of his works that focused on biblical scenes and biblical figures. So hence a lot of the clothing would look more historical, antique from earlier times. And Rembrandt was known for collecting these costumes, and Bol was doing the same, so this way he can dress up the figures. Now, this particular painting, it has a very generic title to it, Portrait of a Woman at a Window. And it dates to 1650 to 1654. I tend to think it's actually a little closer on the 1650, and I'll explain why in a little bit. But, and the frame is not original. This would have been probably an 18th century frame. It may have been earlier, but typically plates like this that have the artist's name, those were applied more consistently starting in the 18th century. So whether or not this frame, I tend to doubt, is original to 1650. But his approach to this, and as I was mentioning about some deviations from Rembrandt's work. So again, Rembrandt was intensely interested in the psychological characteristics of the sitters. And some of Bol's early works were following that same attitude. But what we find within this work is the averted gaze of the sitter. She's not looking directly out. And in fact, I think that this work really surpasses to some degree some of Rembrandt's work, because she is actually, her gaze and her body position is extending the space. Typically in Rembrandt's work and earlier works by Bol, they have very neutral backgrounds, typically browns with some olives and some greens. Very neutral. Sometimes there wouldn't even be any kind of drapery or setting as far as a ledge looking out a window. But she is, and I think it's really important, the drapery that's extending has that physical sense of extending out into the viewer space. And the way she's looking, it's making this impression that something's happening out here, that she's looking, rather than that direct gaze at us. In that effort, he's taking away some of that psychological connection that Rembrandt was known for connecting. And I think in many ways, the works become much softer than in some of Rembrandt's works. The other key thing that is really different around this time, and this is around 1650, is when Bol was really moving away from Rembrandt's form, is if you notice how light the palette is on the figure. Rembrandt's were typically darker. He had much more interest in, again, that psychological. And here we're seeing these lighter tones. It's almost as though he's trying to bring elements of the Caravaggisti, the Italian painters like Caravaggio, who was trying to integrate the stark contrast, the chiaroscuro, between the lights and darks. But it's not, but he's also maintaining the tradition of Northern painters in the Dutch period. And so there are elements here that really start to show him what I believe is really coming into his own as an artist and really defining his style of the tronies and creating these portraits. He was also known for his historic paintings. Much like Rembrandt and a lot of painters at the time, they often were relying on commissions first of creating multi-figure scenes that would be guilds or other particular groups. And then they would start getting these commissions for individual portraits. And at this point, Bol was really the most successful artist in Amsterdam, surpassing Rembrandt for commissioned works in the 1650s. Rembrandt, as far as his commissioned works, were waning. And Bol was really, coming up, and I think a lot of it is because he was really applying a fresher perspective on the portrait painting and really establishing, again, himself. Now, this is really, really exciting when doing research and finding out about this piece and some of this when we receive objects that come into our collection, there's initially some research. And our previous director, Bob Wicks, and Laura Stewart, our prior collections manager and registrar, had collected some information, just, some survey materials. And it indicated that there are 3, potentially 4 versions of this painting. And so it really begs the question of, for one, why that many, which is not that often, except, as we know, pupils and assistants in workshops were often copying the works of their mentors, and especially works that were intended to be or became very successful and desirable paintings. Now, some of them are signed, some of them aren't. Ours, in fact, is not signed. But the other versions of this painting, there's one in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, which deviates a little bit from this one. To me, looking at the comparisons, the most notable difference is in the necklace and the brooch is actually raised up higher, which reveals a little bit more of the cleavage. So for whatever intent, maybe that was desirable for the person who was requesting a copy. And, there could be multiple paintings because perhaps there were other family members. Now, we have the title, Portrait of a Woman at a Window. The identity of this woman is recognized to be Ernestina Francisca, who is from outside of Amsterdam, kind of southeast of Amsterdam, where her family was from. Her father was a prince within the period of the 17th century time period of the Holy Roman Empire, so he was quite affluent. And the name has come because of the versions that are in, for example, the Hermitage. Now, there's also another version that's in a collection in Liechtenstein, and then there's another version that is in Germany. And what I find really interesting is the artist of the version that's in Germany is really very devoid of emotion and character. In fact, her lips are very pursed. Now, this has nothing to do with Germany, but for whatever reason, whoever painted that one, had it been Bol or potentially a student, and it's attributed to, had made that change. And in another one, the necklace and brooch are completely devoid. So it really, I think, leads to some more investigation and some more research to looking into these variations on the works. Now, it is a beautifully executed piece. When it came to the museum in 2017, the following year it did undergo some conservation, which has really restored it. It was not in bad condition at all, but there were some elements of lifting and cracking, so we had that, and it's really a spectacular piece, and to me is really a highlight of 17th century painting that really captures the style of the time. We have some Rembrandt prints. Be amazing if one day we can have a Rembrandt painting, but to me, this is the next best thing, is having a painting by Bol. He painted up until it was 1669, which actually turns out to be the same year that Rembrandt died. It's probably no connection, although he married his second wife, Bol, shortly after Rembrandt died. And his wife was very affluent. And Bol had also done a lot of very smart investing. And by 1669, he decided he was done, and he was not going to continue painting anymore and living off of his wife's affluence and his investments. But he was rather prolific during that brief career. So really excited to have the opportunity to present this gorgeous painting in our collection. So,